Welcome to another edition of our Six Questions podcast. I'm Trent England with Save Our States, where we defend the Electoral College every single day. And I'm really excited to be here with law professor Brad Smith. He's a professor at Capital University Law School, also a former chairman of the Federal Election Commission. You can find him on Twitter at Commish Smith. Professor Smith, welcome.
Thanks, Trent. Nice to talk to you always.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. I want to start off with academia because that's where you are. You just finished grading your papers and things for the semester. Academia is not always an easy place for conservatives. I'm curious what advice you have to conservative students, maybe particularly if they want to follow in your own footsteps and become a professor. How do you navigate all of that in this world that we're in today?
Well, it's really tough for conservative students, especially as you say, if they want to become a professor. On the other hand, I do tell students not to be overly afraid. Don't be too much living in fear and feeling that you can't say what you believe, but you should pick your battles and make sure that you express yourself articulately and in a way that's not personal and not bitter and not over the top. That's fairly standard advice. It can be done. I would note things are much worse in academia, though, than they were when I came in. And my own school indicates that when I began here, about a quarter to a third of the faculty were identifiably, right of center. And today, it's pretty much me. And the others have, passed away or retired. So it is a tough environment. But my bigger complaint is with tenured professors who aren't willing to speak up. The students, they have things to lose, but when you have tenured professors and they're more worried about, are they going to be able to publish some future article or something, or certain things like that. That's where I kind of feel like those are the guys that really need to stand up.
I hadn't really thought about that. That makes sense. I mean, you do find when you go out, having kids in college now myself, you do find that there are maybe more conservative faculty than you would suspect, but yet a lot of them keep their views to themselves, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's kind of understandable, but really, if and that's why you have tenure. And if you're a tenured professor or something, and you're unwilling to kind of stand up and be counted or push back a little bit, I don't know. I just don't know what to say to that.
Yeah. So obviously, former chairman of the Federal Election Commission, that's mostly about campaign finance, but you have a lot of experience in election policy in general. We're going to talk about campaign finance in a couple of minutes, but election fraud, election processes, this has become obviously a huge topic all across the political spectrum. As we move toward the midterm elections this fall, and another presidential cycle that will begin in earnest right after that, what do you think are the election policy topics that people should be focused on to make sure that we have faith in our democratic processes?
Well, I think let me first just briefly address the idea of fraud. If people have read, for example, Robert Carroll's bio of Lyndon Baines Johnson, and if you don't, you can look it up, or you can even look it up on Wikipedia. The kind of fraud that first got Lyndon Baines Johnson elected to the Senate is just unheard of in American elections nowadays. In most respects, our elections really are much cleaner, much less prone to fraud than in the past. At the same time, by the way, I always point out, the idea of voter suppression is something that, it also occurs, but it's something that is nothing like what it was in the past. So we live in a time when there's really relatively little voter suppression and relatively little fraud, and yet there seems to be more concern about both than ever. Now, having said there's not, tons of fraud, there is fraud, and it does occur. Up until about 5 years ago, you could have walked into any academic conference in the United States and you could have said, the main place we have to worry about voter fraud is in absentee balloting. And everybody would have said, yes, of course, we all know that. Why are you bothering to tell us that? There's universal agreement on it. So I think one thing that's unfortunate is that's become a politicized thing when it should not be. And I think for a number of reasons, beyond the fact that there's more fraud in absentee ballots, again, not a lot, but I think some, absentee ballots are also more likely to be discarded, not counted, because they're done away from the polls. The voter can't get assistance if they make a mistake, ruin their ballot in some way. There's more steps for the voter in terms of properly signing it and sending it back and so on. My general belief is that we really need to get back to the presumption of voting on election day, that we should have absentee balloting for people who really can't make it to the polls. I think it should be for excuse, not no excuse balloting. You have to give an excuse, but most any excuse will do. I'm going to be gone or whatever. I think that we should have maybe a couple days of early voting for people who late in the day realize, oh, I'm going to have to work that day or something else, and I can't vote. So just a couple days, maybe, you know, the Thursday, Friday, Saturday, sort of before the election. But I think it's good for our civic life, the idea that we vote on election day, that everybody votes with the same amount of information. You know, you wouldn't have a jury trial where partway through the jury trial, voters could start voting guilty or innocent, and they didn't have to hear the rest of the evidence, but they were locked into that vote. You know, we'd say, no, you wait till all the evidence is in. I think that's good. I think it's good for us to go to the polls as a people, and it reminds ourselves of why are we voting? It's a matter of self-government. And it's not the worst thing in the world to spend about 10 minutes. And by the way, that's pretty close to the median and average time that people spend standing in line to vote. It's not a bad thing to spend 10 or 15 minutes standing in line next to our fellow citizens, kind of reminding ourselves that we are in this together, that we actually have a lot in common, you know, thinking about how your vote might affect other people. So I think there are a lot of reasons why it's just as a civic exercise, it's really good to get, would be really good to get back to that idea that you're expected to vote on election day. Voting by absentee ballot is abnormal. It's not what you should expect to do. While we should make sure that people can vote if they can't make it on election day, that should be the presumption: you vote on election day.
Talking with Professor Brad Smith here on our 6 Questions podcast. Question number 3, right to your primary specialty in campaign finance. We've seen a lot of changes over the last 20 years, the McCain-Feingold law, the Citizens United decision. There are a lot of people today who give to politics in a way that is outside of the political parties, outside of the political campaigns. It's anonymous. What do you think needs to happen in this area of campaign finance regulation, which, you know, it seems like the left, so to speak, has gotten some of what they want. The right has gotten some of what they want. But in reality, it just seems to be pushing more of the political spending outside of the structures, maybe the accountability structures that used to exist. So I'm curious: do we need to go forward by going backward? Is there some better way that we haven't maybe tried yet, at least in recent memory? What do you think, Professor Smith?
Yeah, years ago, of all people, the great liberal justice William O. Douglas said, I don't have the exact quote in my head, but it's basically, political activity should not be equivocated with being a crime. You know, that spending money to voice your views is not a bad thing. You might even wonder, what kind of country do we live in if somebody tries to tell you you can't spend your own money to express your own political views to a wider group of people? And, you know, it costs money to speak, whether you want to rent a hall to give a speech or buy a newspaper ad or a TV ad or, you know, almost anything. Have a computer so that you can tweet. You know, all these things do cost money. I think that what has happened is we've placed restrictions on candidates, and the Supreme Court has recognized, I think wisely, that you can't limit all spending about politics. At one time, the law actually, and the Supreme Court struck this down in Buckley v. Vallejo, attempted to limit any spending of over $1,000 relative to a candidate. What's that mean? I mean, that's virtually all talk about public affairs, you know, in the United States. So the court said you can't do that. You have to let people talk about politics. But you can limit what we give to candidates because that may be corrupting. They talk about quid pro quo corruption. You know, the candidate might say, well, if you contribute to my campaign, I'll vote this way on your tariff. And that was justified to limit this. The end result is that candidates are limited in their ability to raise money. Political parties are limited in their ability to raise money. But other groups, the Sierra Club, the Rifle Association, pro-abortion groups, pro-life groups, people all over are unlimited in their ability to spend. So naturally, more and more of the spending goes to those groups. Now, I always laugh when it's called outside spending. I'm kind of like, these are us. These are, outside. This is the American people. We're entitled to speak out in campaigns. And there's no reason that the campaign should be limited to just the things candidates want to talk about. On the other hand, I think it is true that this gives a little less accountability to a lot of the spending. The candidates can't control their own message, and the images that are presented to people are created by folks whom the voters don't necessarily relate to or understand who's doing it. To them, all things are kind of campaign ads. So I think that we would do well to go back to basically taking off the limits on candidates. I mean, most of our country, we didn't have limits on candidates. Contributions to candidates were unlimited for most of our history. And that's how we elected, Truman and Eisenhower and FDR and Coolidge and, a whole bunch of presidents who, leaving aside how one might feel about the various ideologies, were pretty competent bunch of people. And Congress seemed to actually get stuff done. They didn't always agree with what they did, but they passed, some great bills like the Voting Rights Act and some more dubious bills as well, but they passed them. They passed lots of stuff back then. People felt Congress worked. And I think it can, I don't think money is going to keep it from working. So I would like to see us move back towards saying, look, it's people should be able to spend their money to talk about politics, to give it to candidates to talk about politics and talk about their campaigns. I think that would be healthy for our democracy in the end, and get us out of this constantly battling about, who's giving to whom. I would note one other thing, which is, you kind of mentioned a lot of these groups spend money and we don't know, so to speak, who the ultimate donor is. That's what they say. Who is the real donor? So in other words, if you give money to a group, let's say you give money to, I don't know, Americans for, better sport jackets or something, right? And then they spend money on a candidate. People say, well, we don't know who gave money to Americans for better sport jackets. To which I usually say, who really cares? First, it's their money. Once you give money to a group, it's the group's money. They get to spend it. You don't. So we shouldn't say who's the real spender. The real spender is the group spending the money. But beyond that, I don't think that we gain much by trying to figure out who's really behind the spending. That leads to ad hominem attacks and so on. And it also reduces the number of voices in the political spectrum. You can catch a lot of flack for your political speech, and you can get attacked on Twitter. People can attack your business, boycott your business. And even if you don't care, maybe you're a tough guy. You say, I'm willing to stand up for my views, right? Yeah, but you have to worry about people who work for you, who you might have to lay off, or you have to worry about your family members. I always talk about the classic To Kill a Mockingbird, right? They didn't go after Gregory Peck because he was a tough guy. He was the best shot in the county. Remember, nobody's going to mess with him. With Atticus, they went after his kids. So there's a lot of reasons why people want to keep their political involvement quiet. There are many other reasons than the ones I've given. And, I think that we should stop being so fixated on who's giving the money and pay more attention to who is, or to what people are saying, what their actual message is, what it is they plan to do. I don't really care that much who gives Joe Biden a bunch of money. I really care about whether Joe Biden has a good plan to be president,
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, it seems like, the real question is, what do these people actually stand for? And what are they going to do in office? Not, who's donating to what super PAC. That seems like it's always going down the road of a cheap shot rather than a substantive argument. But I want to ask you, this is question for Professor Brad Smith. The left's answer to all of this is oftentimes public funding. Have taxpayers pay for campaigns. Why is that not the panacea that the left makes it out to be? And why does the left push that as a solution so hard?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One, I think tactically it advantages them, right? I mean, the left controls most of the media and most of the other major cultural organs in the United States, right? So the right benefits more from paid advertising. You don't get the free advertising the other side gets. And by the way, conversely, the left doesn't benefit as much from paid advertising because you can flip on the TV or pick up any newspaper and read left-wing messages all the time. So the ads don't have much added value. They have a lot more added value for conservative groups that are trying to get into the picture. And then I think part of it is just that ideology. They don't like the private sector. They seem to think that somehow government's pure. But in the end, these government financing systems tend not to work. And I just go back to something the late, great P.J. Rourke used to say. He used to say, why would we want our political speech to be funded, by the government, right? They're the people we're trying to talk about. And it is ultimately going to come with strings attached and ways that I think would be detrimental to our political life.
Question 5 here on our 6 Questions podcast for Professor Brad Smith. I got to ask you about the Electoral College. This is something you have spoken eloquently about. Why is it important to preserve the Electoral College?
Well, I think that the biggest thing, first let me clear up something that I hear people say all the time. It's just wrong, including really smart people say it. They say, we're the only major democracy in which you can win the presidency without winning the popular vote. That's just not true. It happens in all kinds of democracies. Now, it happens often in different ways. And I guess we should say that by the presidency, I mean the chief executive officer in the government, which in many governments is with the parliamentary system is a prime minister or premier or something like that. But it's not only that in these governments, oftentimes coalitions are formed after the election in which the second place finisher may head the government, but the systems themselves often lead to outright majorities by parties that don't win, legislative majorities, and thus the chief executive officer that don't win the popular vote. This has happened since World War II. It's happened multiple times in India, in Australia, in Canada, in Great Britain, in pretty much every major democracy. And in particular, in the democracies, I think of Canada, Australia, India, the United States, that span a continent. And that really tells us one of the main reasons, why would we want a system in which every now and then, it's about one time out of 10, right, the candidate who didn't win the popular vote nonetheless wins the chief executive officer or the presidency in our country. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think the biggest is simply that in a big country like this, it matters not just that you have a majority, but how you construct that majority. And having an electoral college in which you have to win states means you have to win across the country. One of the things you see is that in the electoral college, almost every electoral college winner has won a majority of states. There are about 3 exceptions, and those 3 won 25 of the states, and 2 of them won 24 states, right? You can't win the electoral college without winning a lot of the popular vote. Nobody wins the electoral college without either winning the popular vote or at least coming very, very close. But so what is the advantage of maybe a close second place finisher can win the office? It's that they built a coalition that stretches across the country, that has to compete in a wide variety of areas. Can't just roll up the votes in California and New York, which is what the Democrats found in 2016. And so I think that the Electoral College is uniquely appropriate to a large, diverse country like the United States to make sure that we hold together as a country and don't become, one geographic faction sort of ruling over another.
That sounds good to me. Professor Brad Smith, our 6th question on the podcast is always the same. It is, who is your favorite founding father and why?
My favorite, I haven't thought about a single favorite, but I guess I would. You
can hedge if you want to hedge and say 2. I've had people do that before. It's kind of cheating, but
okay. I think, let me say this. First, I would go, you play the hits. I mean, I think Washington was truly the indispensable man. And I think Jefferson for his ability to articulate the ideas of liberty and for the role he played and so on. But I'm going to cheat a bit further because I'll raise one who doesn't get mentioned very much and only in the negative. And he probably wouldn't be my favorite, but he's my favorite for this purpose. And that is Elbridge Gerry, who is known almost entirely and solely for gerrymandering. And yet Elbridge Gerry was a very influential guy who signed the Declaration of Independence. He was at the Constitutional Convention and was a very influential speaker at the Constitutional Convention, although ultimately he didn't sign it. Why didn't he sign it? Because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. Oh, what a terrible mistake he made, No, he was right. It needed a Bill of Rights. Moreover, he served then in Congress. He served in the Senate. He served as governor of Massachusetts. He was vice president of the United States. The only thing anybody remembers him for is gerrymandering. But in Congress, he was vital in creating the Fourth Amendment rights against search and seizure, and also in lobbying to include within the First Amendment the right of assembly, the right of the people to come together and associate. So to me, he's a founding father who is almost entirely forgotten, or when he's remembered at all, it's solely for this idea of gerrymandering, he was just governor. He just signed the bill. So I'm going to go with Elbridge Gerry.
It's very strange because Elbridge Gerry wasn't a Republican. There wasn't a Republican Party yet. And, despite the fact that what I've heard in the media is that only Republicans can gerrymander, that when anybody else draws a weird district, it's something other than gerrymandering. And so the whole history of this is just confusing to me.
You've raised a very good point. It does seem like gerrymandering. I mean, that'd be a whole nother interview we could do, but it is an issue that seems to have become a constitutional crisis only when it seemed to work against liberals in recent decades.
Yeah, that's certainly what I've seen in the press. Professor Brad Smith on Twitter at Commish Smith, and a law professor at Capital University Law School in Ohio, and the founder of a great organization now known as the Institute for Free Speech, formerly Center for Competitive Politics, right?
Right, and that's at www.ifs, as an Institute for Free Speech.
Yeah, great organization. So thank you so much, Professor Smith.
All right, thank you, Trent. Good to talk.
Thanks to all of you for watching our 6 Questions podcast. I'm glad to have you part of our social media family for Save Our States, defending the Electoral College every day all across the country. We'll be back with another episode next week.